What we're going to do next is really more of a walkthrough than a lab. We're going to be on the live equipment, and I've got several labs lined up for us here, especially concentrating on the command line. But I want to do a walkthrough first, just like a football team does a walkthrough the day before a game where they just, go out on the field and walk through some plays. That's what we're going to do here, because the commands here, I don't want to scare you off these. You're going to master them, but they are pretty long, and I really want you to have the syntax down. So we're going to walk through it first and then do some labs. And the first thing that we've got to do before we do anything else is enable AAA with the AAA new model command. As you're going to see later in when we're on the live equipment, if you start working with, like, say, a method list, and if you don't know what that is, that's fine, you will in a minute or two. But if you start with this command Aaa Authentication, and then you go on from there, and you hit enter, and you're in global config mode, and it comes up and says unrecognized command. It's not going to say you forgot to enable AAA with the AAA new model command. It's just going to say, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. But as soon as you do enter the new model command, then your commands will be accepted. So everybody trips over that sooner or later in the lab environment. I've done it myself, but you definitely don't want to trip over on exam day. You've got to have that command in there. Also, interestingly enough, this command also overrides every previously configured authentication method for the router lines, especially the VTY lines, and I say especially because those are the ones we tend to use more than the others. And we're going to have that in a lab as well, where we could have, say, the usual login command and then a password. But when you enable AAA, that's going to come out of the config, and we've got to configure something else, because the point of AAA and VTY lines, of course, is we don't want to use a single password for everybody. Now, we're going to name the location of Tacacs or Radius servers, and we're going to do that during our walkthrough in just a moment. But I just want to note right now that we are not limited to naming just one of those. And the key that we're going to use can be named at either the end of the Tacacs Server or Radius Server commands, or with the key option of those commands. And I'll show you all that in just a moment. I know when you read it on the screen, especially the first time, it's like, okay, I got it, I think. And then when you see it in action, it's like, oh, okay, I've got this down. So let's go ahead and we'll look at the data we're going to use for the walkthrough here. And I know a little bit of that is off the screen right now. I'll bring it up. But your Tacacs server, your Tacacs Plus server is going to be at 172.111, and your Radius at 172.112. The router is a client of both with a shared key of CCNP for both. And to determine which is going to be used for authentication and in which order, he said with great emphasis, use the AAA Authentication command, just like we're going to do in a moment. To define the location of the servers and the keys, you can use the Tacacs Server Host and Radius Server Host commands. Your keys can also be defined with the Tacacs Server Key and Radius Server Key commands. I know I've mentioned that twice already, but it's a very important point. There's no real preferred method, because I know a lot of you out there are thinking, well, which one is best? Because that's what I always think if I have two options. But really, there's no right or wrong way to do it here with the keys, as long as you define them. Now, what we're going to do here is create what we call a default list. This is going to be the authentication list to be used if a named list is not used. Because as you'll see, and we'll do some named lists in the labs coming up ahead as well, you can name them, and as always, as I say, try to give them an intuitive name. If you're using it as a telnet list, call it telnet list. But you can also create a default list, and that is just what it sounds like, list to be used if there aren't any named lists to be used. And all of these are called method lists. That's a term you'll hear quite often with AAA. And the only reason we call it that, the methods used to authenticate users are listed in the list. So I think we have the word list up there enough. Let's go ahead and hop over to that live equipment and walk through some commands. So the first one that we're going to do, of course, is what? AAA new model. You shouldn't expect to see anything else, any other console messages, because usually when you say open a new interface or start a new process of some kind, you would usually expect a little confirm message. You're not even going to get that with AAA. You'll just suddenly be able to use your commands. Now, the Tacacs Server and Radius Server commands I'm about to use, you could use those without enabling AAA. You could. but it really wouldn't do you much good because by the time you start creating your method list, which actually begin with AAA, the command that is, it wouldn't do you much good because you wouldn't be able to use those. So let's look at Tacacs Server and our options. And don't worry if you've never seen most of these commands because frankly we're only going to use one or two of them for right now. We're saving a little something for the future there. But Tacacs Server, what you could do here is use host, specify a Tacacs Server, host name or IP address. I strongly recommend IP address. I just like it better myself. And you could use that command right there and that would be fine. But you can put the key here as well. Also notice you can change, name the TCP port for the Tacacs Plus server if that is changed on that server and the default is 49. So we'll just go ahead and put it right here. CMP key. And then if we wanted to define where the radius server was, 172.112, key CCMP, and that's really it. Now, we've got the keys defined, we've got the hosts defined, everything else. And so what we've got right now is a Tacacs server out there at .1. We've got a radius server at at .2, and the router is configured as a client of both. So which one are we going to use primarily? And how do we define that? Let's just say that we've decided to use we'll use the radius one first actually. Give me one moment here to go down with that. Yep. So now we're going to start using our AAA commands, and here we're going to use Aaa Authentication. And if we're going to use this for login, this is exactly where you enter login. And we're going to look at quite a few of these later with the banner and the fail messages and everything like that. But right now we're just configuring on login. We're concentrating on that. Now you can create a named list here. Excuse me, and we'll do that in a future lab here in this section. But right now, let's just go ahead and make our default list. And we still have some options here, including an interesting one that says no authentication. And the reason I'm mentioning that now, if you like me, you've got kind of an inquisitive mind, and you sit there and you look at it and you think to yourself, why would I be going to all this trouble of configuring Aaa authentication if I'm going to put no authentication in there? It's certainly a legitimate question, and it's a little bit of a teaser because I promise later I'm going to make a short little video just on the none authentication, and you can see exactly why we would actually use that. There is a reason. Now with local and local case, there we've got use local username authentication, and with local authentication, of course, we're referring to the database that we create with the username password command. We're going to do that in another lab as well. So what I want to do here is show you the group commands. So if we go with group, because you might be looking at this and saying, okay, this is all fine, but where do I put, the location that I want to use, radius first, or that I want to use Tacacs first? Well, actually, you have to put the word group here, and there are your options for radius and Tacacs Plus. So if we wanted to use the radius server first for authentication, and then we wanted to use Tacacs Plus, we need to put radius first. Because what's interesting about this, and it's right up there with no authentication to me when I first looked at it, because my thinking with authentication is like, okay, when I'm looking at it, I'm going to have one method of authentication and that's going to be it. But you can name multiple modes of authentication or ways to authenticate users. You can actually put 5 different ways here. That's the limit. And again, like with no authentication, I'm thinking, okay, why in the world am I going to have up to 5 different methods of authentication? Hang in there and you're going to see that in just a minute. But here you put radius if you're going with that first. And then notice that this is a legal command by itself. You would expect that, but we can still put, use the enable password for authentication, use another server group, use a line password, use the local username authentication, use case sensitive local, or no, for none, that is. So let's go ahead and put another group here. And again, this is a legal command by itself, but we still have those other options. And the key here is that the methods are going to be used in the order in which you enter them in the command, from left to right. And I hate to say the left to right part, but I just want to make that very clear. So here radius would be the first method, and then tacacs would be the next. We can name up to 5, as I mentioned. And like I said, you may wonder, why in the world are we doing that? Well, we're doing it as kind of a backup. You know, we'll take all the redundancy we can get. Now let me enlarge this a bit for this video. Let's say we have an end user coming in, sends an authentication request in, and it's sent to the radius server because it's going to check the radius server first. Now, we would think, you know, and on the surface, you would look at this and say, well, there are really only 2 possibilities here. You know, either the user is going to pass authentication or the user is going to fail authentication. But there actually is something else that could happen. And hopefully it's not something that happens terribly often, but we could have a timeout on the request, you know, which is neither a pass nor a fail. And we could just have, you know, some kind of error, but a timeout would be the most likely thing to have happen here. If there is an error or a timeout, then the second method listed would be checked. This is a very, very important point here, and I want to make sure we're all crystal clear on it. If the radius server actively failed the user, then that's the end of the process. If we get a message back on this router that says authentication failed, then the router would not go to the second method. The second method and the third method and the fourth method and the fifth method, if you go out that far, are strictly backups in case the methods in front of them time out or return an error in authentication. Not a failure, but an error. And I really want to make sure we're clear on that. I would be amazed if that didn't come up on your exam because at first, like I said, you just look at it and you think, well, authentication is pass-fail, you know, and that's it. But that's not quite it. And really, that's about all there is to it, you know, for our walkthrough. You know, you've seen exactly how to create a default list. And again, if this is the first time that you've seen this material, it's a good time for me to give you this little bit of advice anyway. Because again, if you're like me, especially when I started my studies, I'd be kind of hard on myself sometimes if I didn't absorb something like the very first time I saw it or even the second time. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in the course, period. But AAA, you know, we've got 3 different things that we could be working with to begin with, and we've got all these different methods to use passwords. You know, be gentle with yourself if you're not picking all this up the first time, because it's tricky to do so. That's why I've got several labs here lined up for us. We're going to use the command line as much as we possibly can, and we're also going to look at CCP, which is a little easier to work with, of course, because it's a GUI. So do not be hard on yourself if you're thinking, you know, if your head's swimming a little bit right now. But just keep that in mind with that authentication command. We're working left to right, and the only time that we would ever go to the second method is if the first method timed out or actively returned an error. If the authentication actually fails, then we do not go to the second method. So we're going to go ahead and hop over to some labs right now in the next couple of videos, and also I'm going to show you what that none option is all about. So let's head start right over there.